Well, I've always assumed, like, using the rest of the soliloquy, it seems to me that what Shakespeare's talking about is you can either be present or you can be absent.
Right.
And with the people that I have spoken to, the unobserved movement of thought is absence. So the opposite of that is presence, which is the being. And I think that one's true self is that part of oneself which knows itself to exist, which is conscious of itself. So we all have that. It's just that we don't pay attention to it because the life is so fascinating, isn't it? The outward life. I mean, if one's honest, you can go a whole day without remembering, like, that something is looking.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, the first question was so heavy. Don't be intimidated. Yeah. Well, it was a very interesting moment in my life, because I really view my career, I view my life really as like before and after Fellini. Because being cast by him was the greatest compliment an actor like myself could get, that he actually wanted me in the part, that was wonderful. However, from the age of about 12, I was in love with a chick called Silvana Mangano. I'd seen a film of hers called Bitter Rice, and I fancied her like to death, And, so consequently, one day in the street when I was living in Rome, I walked down the Spanish Steps and I walked straight into that street opposite, I think it's Via Condotte, and I see walking toward me Piero Tosi, who was working on my costumes, was Fellini's costume designer, and at the time was considered the greatest designer in the world, and he's with another guy who turned out to be his boyfriend. It was a guy called Roberto Coppa, and this woman. And when they got closer, I thought I was going to pass out because it was Silvana Mangano, right? Now, I don't want to mislead you when I say that she was a young grandmother, because she was not like any other young grandmother I had ever met. However, they got close, and Piero said, "Oh, Silvana, this is my friend Terence," and da-da-da. And I'm just like, and she starts saying to him in Italian, "Wouldn't he be wonderful in Pier Paolo's film?" And then she looked at me and she realized that I probably didn't speak Italian, which I didn't. And she said, "Do you know Pasolini?" And I said, "No, I know who he is, but I don't know him." And she said, "Oh, well, he's making a film, and you would be wonderful in it." And I remember saying, "Are you in it?" and she said, "Si, si." And I said, so then, next thing I knew, Pier Paolo and his producer, who was the nephew of Roberto Rossellini, flew to London, and they stayed in Claridge's, and I was asked to go and meet them in Claridge's, which I thought was strange because I'd heard about Pasolini being a real left-winger, Anyway, I go to Claridge's, and he doesn't speak any English, and in fact, The only time he ever spoke to me really was at this meeting. And he said, through the translator, it's a story of a petit bourgeois family in Milan. There is a father, mother, son, daughter, and a maid. A stranger arrives and seduces all of them. This is your part. I said, I can do that. And the only clue I got from him was that the guest, the stranger, had a divine nature. That was how Pier Paolo saw it. And I didn't have really much clue about that. I'd met Krishnamurti, but I'd been unable to understand a word. But on the first day of filming, I realized that Pasolini had his own camera. So there was the #1 camera, but there was a handheld camera which he was working himself. And it became apparent to me that he was shooting me when I wasn't ready, or when he assumed I wasn't ready. So I thought, oh, this is easy, right? I just have to do absolutely nothing, right? Which is what I did. So I arrived at the performance in the present, really. And as there were no speaking, there were no lines for the stranger, I didn't have to prepare it in any way. I just had to be completely okay with spontaneously what came up. So that was one of my great performances. Doing nothing.
Thank you.
Pleasure. How old are you?
58.
Okay. No, it's just that I get a very kind of recognizable response from people when I'm in the street, you know. Sometimes there's a group of guys, some of them black, some of them white, all pretty fearsome looking. And I find that they're staring at me like they want to kill me just because I'm a skinny queen, you know what I mean? They have real animosity toward me. And what I generally do is, like, when they get really close, I say, "Kneel before Zod, you bastards!" You know? and they say, it is, it's him, you know. And I know by the age, because it's probably the first movie their parents ever took them to see. And the truth was that I had been out of work since '69, and I was actually living in the ashram, trying to learn about tantric sex and wearing orange. And I got this, but we used to go, myself and a group of English sannyasins used to go to this hotel called the Blue Diamond for what was laughingly called full English breakfast. You can imagine what it was like. And when I had arrived in Pune with the idea of going to listening to this Rajneesh that I'd heard about, I guess I must have sent my agent a postcard, my long-suffering agent, you know, saying, I'm in Pune, I'm fine, you know. Anyway, after about a year I'd been there, I'd go there one Sunday morning to breakfast with my mates, Swami Yoga, who was like Jamie Curzon in real life, you know. And whenever we go into the hotel, the concierge, because they're great film goers in India, I mean, probably some of the best in the world, and this guy pulls out this kind of dog-eared telegram. Remember the old telegrams with the printing on the front? It's, Mr. Terence, we got a cable for you, sir. And he gives me this beaten up cable. And as I look at it, the psychic weight of this cable becomes heavy in my hand. And it's addressed to Terence Stamp, the Rough Diamond Hotel, Pune, India. So I know the fact that it's in my hand, it's going to be life-changing in some way, you know. And I open it, and it's from my long-suffering agent, Jimmy Fraser. Would you like to come back to England to talk to Dick Donner about Superman 1 and 2? You have scenes with Marlon Brando. I was on the night plane the next night, you know, with Bhagwan's blessing, I have to say. So the truth was that I'd been out of work for 9 years. And I was a bit worried when I went down to do the camera tests. I was a bit worried that Dick Donner was trying to make me look as ugly as possible. He was shooting me from below, he was lighting me, I mean it was... And I was friend at the time with a guy called Baron Frederick van Pallant, who was Nina and Frederick. And I said to him, I don't know if this is going to work, you know. They're just trying to ruin my look, because I was only... about 35, you know. And I still, although I hadn't been out of work, I had been out of work, I regarded myself as a leading man, you know. And I said to Frederick, I've got worries about this, you know. And Frederick said, listen, the way moviegoers are today, if they can make it seem that you lot can fly, it's going to be a huge success. And most of the kids will identify with the supervillain rather than the guy with the pants on outside his trousers, you know. And so that gave me a kind of confidence, you know. So the thing about my particular kind of acting, I don't have to prepare very much. I remembered I used to listen to that piece of classical music, the Something of Zardoff. It was like a classical piece. I used to kind of listen to that before I used to go to work. But in other words, I really regard everybody as everything. But I think that it's like part of the job of the creative artist to kind of look at the really terrible parts of himself. And the trick is like without judgment. So as far as I was concerned, Zod wasn't the supervillain. He was just super. Do you know what I mean? So that was, and I think that the thing that made it the only real commercial success I've ever been in, well, of that period, was the fact that for a whole generation of kids it was their first movie. And my friend Frederick was right. They were more interested in the villain than the Superman. Yeah. The thing was that when I went to work with Fellini, I said to my agent, like, why do I go to meet this casting director? And he said, well, it was written for Peter O'Toole. And Peter O'Toole has been like flirting with Fellini for years. Oh, we must do something together, darling, you know. And so finally Fellini gets a subject and writes it for him. and sends him the script. And apparently he got a call very late one night, and O'Toole said, "I don't want to do your movie, I'm a bastard, I'm sorry, goodbye." So Fellini apparently called a casting director in England and said, "Send me your most decadent actors." An actor called James Fox and I went. And it was during my very short period of smoking Acapulco Gold, I think it was. So I arrived in Rome. I'd just finished a Western where my hair was dyed blonde and the roots were growing in. And I had ankhs and beads, and I stumbled off the plane. And Fellini just fell in love with me. And he moved me out of my hotel into his home with him and his wife, which was a life-changing experience. And give you a quick idea of what Fellini is like, because it's a story not many people would, well, I don't think anybody's ever heard of it. On the first day, I realized that I'm called to my mark, and I realized that, like, I'm going to be shot, you know. So I catch his eye and I say, and he looks at me like I was a puppet that had come to life, you know. I said, "Yeah, you can." He said, "Dimmi, che cosa?" I said, "I'm an English actor. I'm working in Rome for the first time. I'm working for the great director Fellini. This is my first day. It's my first take. I want some direction." So he didn't pause. "Listen, Terence, last night you was at a party, but really it's a orgy. With smoking marijuana, cocaine, and drinking, and fucking, everybody fucking. You fucking blonde with big tits, big black guy fucking you, all night fucking. Now this morning, somebody drives you to the airport, gives you a big tab of LSD, now you're here." I said, "Okay." So I never had to ask for direction anymore. However, during the film, and when the film gets really near to starting, I have to move out of his house, and he moves me to a beautiful little hotel called the Inghilterra. And he gives me an interpreter. And he gives me an interpreter because he can't spend time with me and I don't speak Italian. And the interpreter turned out to be an astrologer. She was Fellini's astrologer. And one day she says to me, "Oh, you've been invited to a lunch with Krishnamurti." And I say, "Who's Krishnamurti?" "Well, you know, he's Krishnamurti." I say, "Yeah, but is he a film director?" No. He's a sage. Now, I'm 27. And I'm famous, but I'm really an East End spiv, you know what I mean? I'm winging it, you know? And the only sage I know goes in the turkey with onions that my mother... And may God strike me dead. I mean, that's what I know of the word, you know? Anyway, I go to this lunch. Now, the thing about the lunch was that many, many years later, I understand how I got to be there. Now, Fellini had written a script, it was called The Voyage of Masturna, and it was a vehicle for Mastroianni, actually. But he used to kind of like, he liked to talk to me about it, but he didn't want to show it to me. But what I gathered, that the screenplay, the canvas of the screenplay, was that time when the body is dead, but the mind doesn't realize it. So that was the canvas. So you can imagine what Fellini would do with that, right? And I guess he found it a bit difficult to raise the money, because he apparently asked this woman called Vanda Scaravelli, who knew Krishnamurti, when your friend Krishnamurti comes to Rome, could you introduce him to me? Because I'd like to talk to him. So she, a few months later, she said, yeah, Krishnamurti's in town. I've arranged for you to meet him, you know. And Fellini said, I guess, feeling a bit nervous, what's he like? And Vanda said, oh, he loves movies. This, I haven't heard this story till like 20 years after the event, right? So he cuts together about 15 minutes of the rushes of the film that he and I are making, which was by Edgar Allan Poe. And he shows Krishnamurti by way of like breaking the ice, you know. And apparently when the little film finished, Krishnamurti said, I'd like to meet that boy, which was why I was invited to the lunch. Now, when I get to the lunch, it's a lot of people. They're all like stringers from Time and Newsweek. But I'm at a little table opposite this guy, this little Indian guy. And we don't speak. But because I'm staring at him, whenever he catches me staring at him, he lowers his eyes, you know. But I remember thinking, I've never met anybody like that. Like, it was so unusual, you know. And after the lunch, and he's answering questions from the stringers on Newsweek. And after lunch, his secretary, who's a guy called Alan Naudet, comes over to me and said, would you like to go for a walk with Krishnamurti? I said, yeah. So he and I go out for this walk around the like suburbs of Rome. And not having had the nerve to talk, I now can't stop chattering. And occasionally we stop. And he puts his hand on my arm and he says, look at that tree. Tree. I look at him, he smiles, I smile, we carry on walking, I carry on talking. 10 minutes later he stops me, he says, look at that cloud. Cloud. It's not lit from within, it's cloud, you know. We carry on walking, I carry on talking. However, I was never the same after that. And he did something to me, which I years later understood. He used his presence to pause my own thought. And something inside me started reaching out to me. And whilst it took me 15 years maybe to understand, when the eagle flies, it leaves no mark. What? The observer is the observed. What? But something changed. So that's my overriding memory. So it was a life-changing thing. Do you understand? That was 68. And as I say, I was headed for Glasgow and I wound up in Iceland, you know. I've done so many. They really fall into kind of eras of my life, really. So I would say my very first movie, which was a film called Billy Budd, that was, you know, it's got to be one of my all-time favorites. The first film I made in Hollywood, which was The Collector from William Wyler. recently I would say the song for Marion, and it was such a wonderful experience in terms of this thing I was talking about earlier, that, you know, from Billy Budd, where this transcendence happened in one scene, to a song for Marion where it happened in every take. And Vanessa and I were lucky enough to have a director, although he was young and relatively inexperienced, he was sensitive enough to realize like what was going on. So the whole film was like take one, really. And although I don't have any conversations with Vanessa. However, between action and cut, we're like twin souls, you know what I mean? There's no separation between us, you know. And so I would have to say, of the recent era, Song for Marion would be my favorite. What happened was that prior to my first film, I was taken by a great friend of mine called Lionel Barr, who was directing me in a play. And he took me to meet Anthony Newley, who was one of my long-term heroes, because he was a working class kid who'd worked his way through like kids' drama school, and he'd been discovered by David Lean, and he was a kind of genius, really. And when Lionel took me to his house, Newley had just finished writing Stop the World, I Want to Get Off. And he was so excited to have Lionel there, because Lionel was like no coward. I mean, he wrote the music and the words, you know. So, oh, come, and he didn't really notice me. And he played us the whole score. What kind of fool am I? I mean, I can't believe it. I'm listening to Newley perform his own creation, you know. And at the end of it, he suddenly realized that I was like there. And he was a bit embarrassed because he'd ignored me, kind of thing. And Lionel said, oh, this is my friend Terence, you know, he's got his first movie, he's going to be starting in 2 weeks, you know, and he's working with Ustinov and Newley. Suddenly I had Newley's attention. And I said to him, what to do? And he thought, and he said, if in doubt, do nothing. So it's not from nobody, you understand? It's from Anthony Newley. He's like a genius, you know. So I start on Billy Budd, and I'm getting along fine. Ustinov is wonderful with me. But at the end of the script is this scene where Billy, who's like an angel, is about to be hung unjustly. And the men are on the point of mutiny. And it says in the script, there is an air of peace about Billy that quietened the men's protests. And I thought, how am I going to do that? Like, how can I do that? So all through the location, I'm worried about this scene. And I'm still a bit of a method actor, you know, so I'm thinking about emotional memory and da-da-da, but I can't think of anything to do. So on the day, I think, well, I haven't come up with anything. I'll have to do what Newley says. I'll have to do nothing. And I can't tell you how frightening this is for a performer, you know. But, so I step up to the mark, and when thoughts come in my head, I just let them go, and I'm waiting. And they say, okay, Stan Campana, you know, on your marks. And a little tune comes into my head. And I think, oh, God, got a big empty head, you know. And then I suddenly realize, that's the song my gran used to sing to me when I was 11. Just after I'd passed the 11 plus, which was like a miracle. And I used to go to her house to do my homework because there was no little brothers and sisters, you know. and she would be in her scullery making me a marmalade sandwich, and she would sing, "Little Dolly daydreams, pride of Idaho, well, don't you know, well, don't you care?" So I just went with the song, and I heard action, and I felt the sun shining, and I felt a breeze coming, and this, out of this song came this feeling. And it was just like, it was incredibly tender, but it was a kind of an amazing kind of peace. And I just remember kind of turning my look to the men, you know. Now I knew it was right. I never spoke to anybody about it. Anybody. Because it was like too personal in a way. It was like private. But at the premiere, everybody burst into tears. Now, apart from the fact that the cameraman, who was Robert Krasker, who lit Third Man, had made me look better than I looked in real life. So I gave up the stage straight away. I thought, this is my destiny, you know, if I can look like that, when I really look like this, you know. And Empty Head became my mantra. Because the feeling was, it was coming from the best of me, that I knew intuitively, but I couldn't locate. And for 30 years, 35 years, it only ever happened between action and cut. But it didn't alter my feeling about it. And because I thought, it's there somewhere. It's there, but it's not mine to command. And then it happened. It happened on stage when I did a reading for the Airborne Symphony at the Barbican, and that feeling came, and that was the first time it came, other than on a film set. So it's the opposite of what you say. Do you see what I mean? It's something that was there, but that has been kind of leading me in a funny way. And it starts with the empty head. But out of the empty head, it's empty, but it's aware. But out of the stillness of the presence comes a movement that's not the movement of thought. Do you see what I mean? It's a movement of some sort of deep sort of feeling. Sorry about that. Because originally I'd been given the galleys of the proof of John Fowles as The Collector, and I'd read it on the bus. I'd started to read it on the bus coming home, and I realised that I couldn't do it. I realised it was a kind of masterpiece, but it was a kind of plain, snotty-nosed, spotty bank clerk, and I thought, I can't do that. Like, I can't get anywhere near it. So I turned it down. And the producers, two guys called John Cohn and Judd Kimberg, kept coming back to my agent and saying, Terence, you know, I kept saying no. Finally, they said, we've got William Wyler. You're going to turn down William Wyler. And I said, well, who's the girl? And they said, well, Wyler's testing English girls. He's having Bob Parish fly over to test the English actresses. And I said, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll do the tests with the girls. And I'll show Wyler the closest I can get to it. So I did the test with the girls. And then I heard Weiler flew in, and I was asked to go and meet him at the old Columbia building. I think it was in Dean Street. And I go there, and I'm waiting in a vestibule on the second floor, and people are opening doors and sort of checking me out, closing doors. Suddenly a door opens at the very end of the corridor, and this kind of diminutive guy starts walking toward me. And he's just staring at me. And he gets right this close to me, and he's still staring at me. And he doesn't say anything. And I feel a bit unnerved. I mean, I'm only like 23, I think. And I say, have you seen the test? I said, which girl do you like? And he says, I haven't seen the girls yet. So, do you really want me? There were two, the world's two greatest directors were William Wyler and Billy Wilder. They were not only critically the most successful, they were financially the most successful. So it was just a really wonderful, it was just a kind of wonderful experience for me, really. I can't remember him ever giving me any direction. You know, but I knew that, like, apparently when Olivier worked with him on the first day, Olivier told me this, after the first take he came up to Larry and he said, Larry? So he was that kind of guy, you know what I mean? Didn't take a lot of words to tell him. So I think I should sign a few books now, otherwise I'm going to keep...